You ever struggle with doing the right thing? It's like, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I don't want to do that right now. I don't like that particular thing. And I know that's what they tell me I should do, but I'd rather do this. And it's not that necessarily it's a morally right or wrong thing all the time. It's just that I just don't want to do that thing. Sometimes it's a matter of motivation, getting our motivation right. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and Paul's going to talk to us here in Romans 13:8, actually has been, about getting our motivation right. He's been talking to us since chapter 12 about believers who are stable and mature, playing a positive, contributing role in believers who are less mature, becoming stable, rather than becoming a hindrance to them. And yeah, sometimes because we want to do what we want to do, and it may not necessarily be a right or wrong thing, but it just doesn't help them, it can actually hinder them. So as yesterday we were talking about paying your taxes as part of obedience to government, which we talked about previously. And Paul says here in verse 8, we left off at this very first phrase, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. This one another is the allelus. It's an adjective that is talking about a group of people and love among that group, one another like this. It's reciprocal. It's going on among them. We ought to be loving one another. And Paul says part of your obligation ought to be loving those people rather than owing your taxes because you refuse to pay them and you haven't paid them, you don't want to pay them. I don't believe really verse 8 is talking about not carrying debts, taking out loans or anything. People have used that, but I think most people that know the Bible know that's not really what he's getting at. That's out of context. But then we come to this last phrase here in verse 8 where he says, for the one who loves his, I'm reading from the New American Standard 2020 edition, loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. And I disagree with that. I realize there's a lot of people that come to this conclusion. And the problem is, and see if I can explain this to you, is the first part of this sentence, he says, for owe or be obligated to no one for anything except to love one another. That ought to be the obligation that you have. For the one loving. Now the New American Standard goes for the one loving the other. So they make the break there. The one loving the other. In this case, the New American Standard has taken neighbor, and they've taken that from verses down below that we'll hit in just a minute. And it says, has fulfilled law. It doesn't actually put a the in front of law, unless this goes up here. Because the other way to handle this is to say for the one loving. And you don't need an object for that, because he gave you the object in verse 8. So the object is implied by the context. You're loving one another. And therefore, the other doesn't go with the person you're loving, but it goes with law. So the other law he has fulfilled. And the word other here is not one another, it's heteron, meaning the law that is different. Or if it's love, it would be you're loving that different one rather than loving one another, which I don't know exactly how that would play out. And there's a possibility, to be honest, that the translators don't really see a major distinction here between allelus and heteron. I do. I think he's different. They are different. And so this adjective different here that they're translating neighbor, I believe goes with law. Now, one of the reasons for that is that this adjective allelus here, Jesus used that over in John 13:34. And I understand a lot of people, when they talk about the command to love, they're going to go to Jesus' statement earlier in his ministry when people say, what is the greatest command of the law? And he says it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. And secondly, the second command is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's not really our command. That was the greatest command under the law. This command in John 13:34, Jesus gives this the night that he will be betrayed. This is the last night of his earthly ministry prior to his cross. And he says, I give to you a new kind of command. We've talked about this before. It's a new kind of command. Does it bear some similarity to the commands of the law? Yes, it does. But it's a new in kind because he says you're going to love one another with all you've got. No, you're going to love one another like I have loved you, that you should love one another. And it's a one another kind of love. It's a love that you have for each other. This is one of the things that churches struggle with, I really believe today, is that we think the way to reach the world is to love the world. We need to go out there and let the world know that we really love them and care for them. And that is not chiefly how we reach them. In fact, he says in verse 35, by this all will know that you're my disciples if you have love for one another. Again, down here in verse 35, the same word. So it's when the world sees believers loving each other, not loving them, but actually this kind of love here between saints. That's our command. And that's how the world he doesn't tell us we can't have a love for the world, but don't confuse that love with this new command. And don't confuse that love with how the world knows we are his disciples. So if we go back over here to Romans 13, I do not believe that heteros is the object of the love. I believe heteros is telling us it's the other law he has fulfilled. Now, what's the other law? Well, I believe it's the Roman law. In other words, you are setting out here to love other believers. But in the process of doing that, you're fulfilling this different law, the Roman law that says you have to do this and you can't do this and you have to pay these taxes. And let's put it this way. As a believer, and we've talked about this, you are to obey the law of the land and you are to pay your taxes. And so you had better know if you are going to resist the government, you had better know that you are doing something that the Bible specifically requires you to do, or that the government's requiring you to do something that the Bible specifically prohibits you from doing. And I find a lot of times that there's Christians. I'm gonna pick on something that I used to get in a lot of disagreements on. I'm not trying to pick a fight with you, but I used to have people that insist that it is a sin to send your kids to public school, and that you should homeschool your kids. Now, today homeschooling is not a controversial thing. Atheists homeschool their kids. Christians homeschool their kids. But there was a time that I remember Christians when I was growing up that absolutely insisted on the fact that they did not have to listen to the government with regard to any schooling directives. And they did this because they were mandated by the Bible to school their children. And they really had to go to the Old Testament and say where the Old Testament told them to raise those children learning the law. That's not the same thing as teaching the kids how to read, how to write, and how to do math. And it's the same thing in the New Testament when it tells us to raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. That's not talking about their secular education. So I just use that as an example. I really don't want to offend any, but I'm just using it as an example of don't confuse what you think you ought to do with your kids with some biblical directive. And there's lots of examples that we could probably draw on that we as Christians mix up. So Paul then is going to say here, he has fulfilled this other law, verse 9, for do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet or lust. And if there's any different, interestingly enough, he uses the same word different command here, the same word he had up there. It looks slightly different at the end because we have a different gender and a different declension for the word command than we have for the word law. But he says the different or the other command, if there's any other one then, it is then headed up in this, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. Now that was, as Jesus said, that was the highest statement of the law. And if they attended to that, if they really loved their neighbor like they loved themselves, then they're not going to commit adultery with their neighbor's wife. And they are not going to murder their neighbor. And they're not going to steal from their neighbor. And they're not going to be coveting after something that belongs to their neighbor. I mean, think about that. If you looked at your neighbor and there was stuff that they had all the time and you were coveting that, is that going to impact the way that you relate to that neighbor? Yeah, it might be a little bit subtle, but it's going to come across. And so even under the law, love for your neighbor, if you loved your neighbor as yourself, it caused you to keep that law and abide by that law in a certain way. So that when we come back up here to verse 8, I believe, and you've seen my case for this, that we're to love one another, and the one loving then would be one another. He's fulfilled this other law. In other words, if you really love those other believers, guess what? You're not going to be flaunting your liberty against the law. You're not going to be then you're not going to be thumbing your nose at government, and you're not going to be doing these things that in reality are not creating a good testimony for Christianity, but it's not sending a good example for these young believers, these immature believers that need to learn how to rely on God and live the Christian life by the way God wants us to, in love. Because we're putting ourselves first rather than really loving them. And we want to encourage them, just as ourselves, to have a good day in the Lord. And we can do that when we love them, and love them by abiding by the law of the land. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and again, I thank you for joining me today.